Hello, our listeners. This is İlhan Taner. We have today Michael Weiss, who is a CNN analyst and also contributor to Daily Beast, Coda Story, and many others. Michael Weiss has been following Syria from the beginning of the uprising in 2011. He has been writing over Syria countless time on very important outlets, including CNN and many others. And he is also the co-author of the best-selling book on ISIS, titled Inside the Army of Terror. And you can follow him on Twitter at Michael Weiss if you have not already. Michael, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
So my first question, today Turkish officials were in Moscow talking to their counterparts. They are trying to get some kind of deal on Manbij. I don't know if they reach a deal yet, but what is your reading on Manbij first, and secondly on the near future of northeastern Syria? What is your envision of northeastern Syria?
Well, I mean, nothing in Manbij will change until the U.S. troops are out of there. And contrary to the reporting yesterday, which was largely reliant on regime propaganda, they haven't left yet. So on the ground, very little has changed. When U.S. troops pull out, the question also remains who else is going to pull out? Because remember, it's not just American soldiers in Syria. You have British and you have French special forces on the ground. The French seem to be making noises like they have no plans to withdraw and to stop supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. So there are a lot of variables here. But let's assume that if the U.S., when the U.S. pulls out, I should say, and if its allies in the coalition follow, I could see a deal being brokered for Manbij where Russia and the regime prevail upon the YPG to withdraw their forces and allow Turkey in. Or similarly, I could see a kind of power sharing arrangement between, I should say, the pro-regime forces, because on the ground it's not really the Russians, it's the Iranians and Assad and his militias, and the Turks. The Turks already have control of 2 out of the 3 cities in the so-called Manbij pocket, right? They have Al-Bab and they have Jarablus, which they liberated from ISIS a year ago or more. So to control Manbij would be kind of strategically important for them, I would say. More interesting to me, and you pointed this out yesterday, and it's a distinction with a difference. If we leave Manbij aside and we look only at east of the Euphrates, the messaging coming from Moscow, particularly from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, was we support the Turks invading, and we consider this, I think he used the term, a cleansing operation of terrorist elements. So it's not exactly the first time in history that the Russians have referred to the YPG or let's be honest, the PKK as terrorists. But certainly this seems to indicate that Putin would much rather do a deal with Erdogan, a state actor with an air force, than he would try to reconcile or co-opt a guerrilla militia, which is essentially what the YPG is, especially when you rob them of their American firepower. They don't stand a chance against a state actor. So they are either going to have to submit to some kind of, arrangement cooked up by the Russians and the Turks, or, as you saw yesterday as well, they're inviting now regime forces to come in to protect them from Turkey. But that has no chance of success. I mean, Assad doesn't want to go to war with Turkey over the PKK. The PKK has been used by the regime as a kind of tactical cudgel against Ankara for many, many years, which is why Öcalan was in Damascus. And I mean, you know the history there. But the main priorities for the regime are to regain the hydrocarbon industry and the resources in Hasakah province, which is where the best of, frankly, not terribly good Syrian oil deposits are. A former Russian diplomat told me in no uncertain terms the first thing Putin will want to do is seize the oil. He has made a deal with his mercenary force, the Wagner group, who famously got taken out several months ago in Deir ez-Zor when they waged a provocation against the SDF and U.S. forces on the ground, that they will get 25% of the profits from, I think it was the Conoco plant in Hasakah. So, the economic motives to retake as much of the Jazeera and as much of Rojava as possible are, I think, going to drive this thing. And look, if you're Russia, and frankly, even if you're Assad, do you really care? Do you want to expend the resources and the military might to essentially take over this American protectorate, or would you rather kind of carve it up as best you can? Assad is in no danger now of losing what is variously called useful or vital Syria, which is to say Damascus, the 3 coastal cities, including Latakia, where Russia's military air base is, access to Lebanon for the purposes of transferring weapons to Hezbollah, and parts now of Homs and certainly the south in Daraa. But like the eastern hinterland of Syria, which is where America's essentially been virtually occupying, the only thing that matters there is the energy resources. And for American interests, the crucial thing was, well, twofold, really. Make sure that ISIS can't reconstitute itself and use the desert regions and the Euphrates River Valley to mount its comeback. And 2, keep Iran from building its land corridor. So a straight shot, essentially, across multiple countries in the region from Tehran to the Mediterranean. With America gone, just think pragmatically. It's in everyone's best interest now, meaning Moscow, Ankara, Damascus, and Tehran, to sort of divvy up the spoils. Erdogan, I don't think he certainly can't occupy all of Rojava, and he's not going to go deep into Deir ez-Zor. But the latest indications seem to be that there's some kind of buffer zone in the offing, specifically 40 kilometers deep. The Turkish military, backed by its FSA proxies, will create a kind of, essentially a boundary that will prevent the YPG from posing any kind of direct national security threat to Turkish interests. The remainder of that, this U.S. overseen area will probably be some kind of hodgepodge of self-rule, limited self-rule, because I don't think Moscow and Damascus do not want to see the PKK as powerful as the United States has made them. They don't want a separatist or a statelet seeking organization ruling 1/3 of Syria. So they're going to try and keep them weakened. They're certainly going to try to disarm them to some degree, but they'll have to do a deal lest they risk civil war, because the PKK will resist any attempt to chuck them out of what they have been their hard-won gains on the back of this war against ISIS. So I see basically what was happening before, which was this kind of de facto carve-up of Syria, is going to happen still, except the United States will not be a party to the negotiations. It doesn't have any hand to play once it withdraws.
This was a very good, excellent unpacking of what might be happening going forward, and thank you for that. But let's look from U.S. side. The Trump administration has been talking about how they are going to put pressure on Iran, and we have been hearing this from top officials, from Jeffrey to others, including John Bolton, that northeastern Syria was going to be one of the points that U.S. was going to encounter Iranian influence. Now that U.S. is withdrawing, how this strategy of U.S. putting pressure on Iran is going to work?
Well, that's a good question. I frankly don't know. It's very strange to see sort of pro-Trump commentators, particularly the Iran hawks, whether it's on Twitter or in their op-eds, make a case for how this administration is really, sticking it to the Islamic Republic. I mean, Trump withdrew from the Iran deal, fine. European companies, European countries are, frankly, just going to line up behind the United States with respect to sanctions rather than take a risk and do business in Iran. So economically, sure, it's going to hurt Iran with the new sanctions regime. But Iran has proven very adept at evading sanctions. And now it has, most of Iraq, frankly, and its financial infrastructure through which to launder funds and to do all kinds of shady black market deals. the Quds Force, the IRGC's expeditionary wing, has been self-financing, as far as I can tell, through various clandestine operations, particularly using Iraqi banks and so on, to get around the international sanctions regime that was in place by the Obama administration. So economics is certainly one arrow in the quiver. But yeah, the point was, look, robbing Qasem Soleimani of his grand vision of creating this corridor for Iranian troops and Iranian militias to just drive from Tehran to Tartus or to Latakia was a major plank of U.S. policy up until last week. And the idea that without a U.S. presence on the ground, the Iranians can achieve this, and yet somehow, I mean, I'm seeing things like, well, we never had a strategy in Syria of which to speak anyway, and arming the PKK was no strategy, it was all counterterrorism, blah, blah, blah, fine. But we were trying to then reconfigure this bad strategy into a more far-reaching strategic planning kind of strategy, which is to say fighting state actors, not non-state actors. How do you do that if you have no skin in the game? I mean, U.S. presence in Syria isn't just about boots on the ground and fighting bad guys. It's also about intelligence gathering capabilities. It's about running assets and informants, having eyes and ears. So the Iranians have got plenty of that. And we are now basically saying we don't want any of it. Let the Turks and the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Iraqis and the Iranians and the Russians all sort it out for themselves. So look, it's a very good question. And now you also have, the other area in which the U.S. has been trying to contain or deter Iranian hegemony has been the war in Yemen. But that war has been a disaster, and it's growing increasingly unpopular and increasingly scrutinized as a result of MBS's ludicrous decision to assassinate a Washington Post columnist in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. So Saudi's currency is trading at record lows. There's bipartisan support for reducing or eliminating U.S. Military aid to the Saudi coalition in Yemen, and now this decision to pull our forces out of Syria. So where does that leave America in terms of its grand plan for containing Iran? I have no idea. No one has given me a coherent answer when I ask. It all, again, comes back to sanctions. But, sanctions, that ain't going to cut it. You have to have some kind of human component in this. You have to have, it's very interesting. If you look at the reported route that Soleimani was looking to create for this land corridor, originally it ran through northeast Syria, right? It ran through Hasakah. And it's kind of a grand ambition. These were all territories that were multi-ethnic. You had Kurds, you had Assyrians, you had Sunni Arabs, so how they were going to pull this off, I don't know. But that was the plan. And this was a plan that was corroborated by regional intelligence, reported, I think, in The Guardian and elsewhere. And then when the U.S. actually committed forces into northeast Syria, the route changed. And then it ran through sort of the southern corridor of Syria. This is why Al-Tanf, the military base that the U.S. and the Brits have been running for the last couple of years, using actually Arab anti-ISIS proxies, so FSA groups that are part of the Pentagon's program to fight the war against jihadists. This is why that base has been so contentious, and it's been attacked by the Russians, by Hezbollah, and by Iranian militia groups. It's because the Iranians need that to complete their land corridor. Well, when the U.S. withdraws from Al-Tanf, they'll have it. But it goes to show that having U.S. troops, having a military presence, having guys with American insignia on the ground was itself a form of deterrence against what Iran had planned to do in Syria. So with that absent, really, I don't know what's stopping them. It is true that there's a competition between Iran and Russia for more regional influence, but the Russians are not ready to deploy their army. They'll use mercenaries, they'll use Spetsnaz, they'll use some conventional military forces. But Hezbollah and the IRGC created militias are the ground troops in Syria. And that also comes to me from a former Russian official. So Russia can simply not be cleaved away from Iran for its own national and strategic interest at this point. So what it's going to try to do is limit the amount of influence that Iran can have in Syria and try to grab more for itself. But again, they're on the same team. And so this axis Damascus, Tehran, Moscow, it ain't going anywhere. And there's nothing the U.S. can do to break it up. And now the question is, well, what was the U.S. trying to do originally? And from what I gathered from my reporting, it was, okay, we have the SDF because this is the only force we found capable, reliable in fighting ISIS on the ground. But we recognize the SDF is problematic for Turkey because even though it's true, demographically, the rank and file of the SDF are a little more diverse than they used to be. The command structure of the SDF is all PKK. Ask any journalist who's gone in there. You're going to see guys from the Kandil Mountains. You're going to see guys from all over greater Kurdistan, not just Syrian Kurds, with their Mao caps, mounting checkpoints and military, bases. These are the guys who control the units, the local militias on the ground. That's a huge problem, not just for Turkey, but also for the Sunni Arabs who live in the Jazeera, who don't want to live under the yoke of a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla organization. So the U.S. policy, privately, because publicly it's very hard to get White House or CENTCOM officials to acknowledge this, was to try and make the SDF more demographically representative of the territory the SDF was controlling. So in other words, bring in more Sunni Arabs, bring in more people who would join the ranks of the SDF and then work their way up to, warrant officer or then major colonel, whatever. That was a milksop to the Turks. The problem is the Turks never really bought it, and they still found the PKK dominance of the SDF to be overwhelming. And they also found America's hypocrisy about arming a group that America itself had designated a terror organization, whilst then jumping through doing these semantic gymnastics as to, the SDF's not really the PKK and all this. I mean, it was all nonsense. And I think Erdogan just kind of threw his toys out the pram and said, well, screw it. I'm not going to rely on America to take it on Turkish national security interests to heart. So I'll just do my own deal with Russia, and I'll put pressure on the Americans to get out of Syria. I mean, with Donald Trump, you had a very easy partner to negotiate that with, because he never wanted to go into Syria in the first place, and he campaigned on American withdrawal from the region. So, Erdogan has played a pretty good hand here. I would also add to this, he's got another ace up his sleeve, which is the Khashoggi murder, the tapes that have been shared now with CIA, and that I think have been shared even with American legislators. Erdogan could release those tapes into the Turkish or international press at any moment, and it would be one of the worst hammer blows to American policy in the region in probably 30 years. It would certainly upend the American-Saudi relationship, because it would be then undeniable that Khashoggi was assassinated. The Saudis would frankly scream bloody murder, no pun intended, at the Turks, and it would really inflame the region in a way that we haven't seen yet. That with the Arab Spring and all these civil wars notwithstanding. So if I were Erdogan, I would be telling Trump, look, I want you out, get out, do it in a coordinated, phased fashion or whatever. But if you don't do it, hint, hint, I might just blow up your spot by acknowledging that your best buddy MBS is a butcher. So, I think it's actually, this is all playing into the Turkish hand very nicely. The question is, and this is, I just ask this all the time when Russia is meant to be a main broker or interlocutor in these things, how much can the Russians be trusted? Now, my fear is, okay, let's say Putin does a deal. They create this buffer zone, whatever, 40 kilometers deep into Syrian territory. The Turks feel somewhat secure, but the Russians also do deals with other partners. So they create some kind of arrangement with the PKK forces in eastern Syria. But then, the regime tries to come in and be overweening and to reestablish its own security and its own political infrastructure. And then there are skirmishes between PKK and regime. You're creating the conditions for not just failed statehood, not just balkanized failed statehood, but also for the next kind of rounds of violence and possibly even civil war in eastern Syria. With the Americans on the ground, at least there was, not just an intercessory force, but a superpower with a mighty air force and a lot of military resources at its disposal to try and keep the peace and to also keep ISIS from exploiting the breakdown in security and the kind of political fallout and chaos. With America gone, like I said, everybody's going to be trying to carve up the pie for themselves. And that only will invite, forget even ISIS. I mean, that's going to invite other Sunni insurgent groups. That's going to invite other terrorist organizations. That's going to invite some of the militias that have been seconded by the regime, who have been fighting the regime, conventional forces, because they're, at odds with each other and their own political influence. It's going to be a pig's breakfast, basically. I'm just not confident that even on whatever's agreed to on paper is going to play out in reality. Now, look, I mean, I don't want Assad in control of any of Syria, given what he's got up to. And you have people like former Ambassador Robert Ford arguing, well, it's better the regime comes back into eastern Syria, then America stays in for the long haul, and they'll do a deal with Russia, and nobody really cares about this patch of territory anyway. Respectfully, I disagree. I think that's very pie in the sky, and that patch of territory happens to be where al-Qaeda in Iraq essentially, lay in wait for America's withdrawal from Iraq in order to mount its comeback. So this is a very long, roundabout way of saying I don't think this is the last America will be in the Euphrates River Valley. I think we're probably going to have to go back in at some point because things are going to fall apart.
Okay, Michael, let me ask one more question since I, find you here. Luckily, you are also expert on Russian affairs and you know Putin very well. Putin-Erdogan partnership, how much do you think this is going to last, or do you think is there any reason for this partnership not to last forever?
Well, in Putin's interest, it's always pleasant to see a NATO ally having a cozier relationship with Moscow than it does with Washington. So there's a kind of a trolling playfulness to that. Also, as I say, Putin would rather have the Turks do some of the heavy lifting than the Russians or even the regime, which can't afford to spread itself thin at this point because it's still a very fragile enterprise. So what I would look at now is what's going to happen to Idlib, right? You have this ceasefire agreement and this, supposed deal where Turkey would take the jihadis out of Idlib and use more moderate FSA groups to kind of govern the territory. Will there be some kind of long-term negotiated settlement for Idlib? Will the Turkish military go in fully to occupy Idlib, take the entire province over, or do a handoff to the regime? I would look at that to see what the future of this relationship is going to be. And look, it's interesting, again, that Russia has now decreed, essentially, the YPG as a terrorist organization. So what it's doing is it is mouthing the national security interests of Turkey, which it would only do if it thought that Turkey would be solidly in its corner to secure Russian interests in Syria. And so the Turkish-American relationship, I mean, that, despite all this stuff, the pastor has been released, sanctions have been lifted, blah, blah, blah, it's not good, even under Trump. And it hasn't been good since 2011. I mean, you and I have talked about this for ages, about, Turkey was the main country that America had to accommodate with respect to the Syrian civil war, and it didn't. And as a result of that, I mean, Erdogan's all of his authoritarian tendencies, his craziness notwithstanding, this is something that just spreads across the Turkish national security and political establishment. It has nothing to do with AKP or Erdogan as a personality figure. It's just Turkey's national security that was jeopardized, and America didn't really care, or it didn't really acknowledge the concerns. So now Turkey is looking to another country, a country that has wanted for a long, long time to regain its prominence in the region, to usurp America's role as the main interlocutor or the first port of call for doing business in the Middle East, and is now to a large extent achieving that. I mean, Russia, whatever you say about it, stands by its allies. America is seen now to be abandoning and betraying its allies. And that is a powerful point of argument in the region. I mean, even forget the Syrian Kurds, even the Iraqi Kurds have told me, look, we'd of course much rather do business with America than with Russia or Iran, but the Iranians have been coming to Erbil for years now saying, why are you bothering with the Americans? They're not in it for the long haul. They don't know the region the way we do. They're not going to stick by you through thick and thin. Then you had, the takeover of Kirkuk. And now you have this perceived abandonment of the Kurds in Syria, and the Iraqi Kurds are saying, we're starting to realize America is not a long-term ally. It's a partner, and it does business. It's transactional, these arrangements. Whereas with Putin, even though he's mostly about the money, he's not about principle, or, he doesn't give a crap about humanitarianism. If he sees that someone is serving his interest, he'll stick by them. And he's not given to the vicissitudes of domestic politics. There's not going to be the Duma rising up saying, why are you in bed with MBS in Saudi Arabia when he's hacking up people in consulates? I mean, that's the benefit of authoritarianism. You don't have to run this stuff through, state or federal representation and then answer to the people in any way. So in a way, what you're seeing now is the future of the region is being decided by dictators, not by the United States. And it's being decided by dictators who, frankly, have had enough of dealing with the United States and trying to get from the U.S. what they could never get, that they're just going to go their own way and do their own deals on the side. And, to a large extent, I think the U.S., at least under this president, is happy with that, because the U.S. is tired of the Middle East.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I hope we are going to have you again soon. Michael Weiss is the co-author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. If you have not read the book yet, it's a must-read book. And today he unpacked for us latest deals between Russian, Turks, Syria, U.S. withdrawing, and many other regional issues here in a very short time. Thank you again so much.